Matthew 19, 3b through 8. Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all? And he answered and said, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. And they said to him, why then did Moses command to give her a certificate of divorce and send her away? And he said to them, because of your hardness of heart, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it has not been this way. It's a really kind of a strange thing to start off this morning with, but this is where Paul is at in his letter. We know that he's been correcting that church at Corinth when they sent Chloe and the delegation to tell him what was going on. But they did more than just that to verbally tell him. They sent a letter. And this is where we're at. Paul is going to be answering these written questions. And this is where the written stuff really comes in. And we want you to notice that as we're going through this, how he lays things out almost in a dialogue style of approach, which is really hard when you're doing it in writing. But he has this really good way of doing it. So let's pick up with 1 Corinthians 7, verses 1 and 2. You'll also have to forgive me. I told you last week my stuff went down, and so I had to start everything from scratch, including my PowerPoint, because my other thumb drive went down, and I haven't quite got things worked out, so it's just going to be flashing on me as I hit a button instead of doing this nice little rotation. And my writing is different. The whole thing is different, so you'll have to bear with it for this week. 1 Corinthians 7, verses 1 and 2. Now concerning the things which you wrote, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. But because of immoralities, each man is to have his own wife, and each woman is to have her own husband. We know that when you look at the word touch here, it is referring to having a sense of sexual relations. And these people are in a certain point in their lives that they're going, and I think that they were misled in a lot of their stuff. So they have this interesting thing. And it's like, should we not ever touch a woman whatsoever? And Paul is looking at them, and they're wanting him to agree with them in this. And he will do it with reservation up to a certain point, and that is where in verse 2 it says, but because of. And he's going to sit there and tell them, no, it is not right. Now, why would the Corinthian Christians suggest complete celibacy, which is what they meant by a man not to touch a woman? Well, they probably figured out that if sexual immorality was so rampant within their city and within their church, and it was a danger to them, that maybe, just maybe, they could be more pure if they didn't have sex whatsoever. We could be very moral then, don't you know? But that's not what he wanted to have happen. Even in marriage, well, even though I'm married, maybe I better not even touch my wife. Ooh. But he tells them, let everybody have his own wife because of all these immoralities that are taking place. And let each woman have her own husband. 1 Thessalonians 4, verses 3 through 5. For this is the will of God, your sanctification, that is, that you abstain from sexual immorality, that each of you know how to possess his own vessel in sanctification and honor, not in lustful passion, like the Gentiles who do not know God. The Greek word for possess is katahoni, to acquire, to get, to procure a thing for oneself, to possess, to marry a wife. I want you to possess. And the Greek word for vessel, skaiousos, an implement, literally or figuratively, especially a wife as contributing to the usefulness of the husband. A man is to procure for himself his own vessel, or, as it says, for the satisfaction of sexual passion and sanctification and honor, i.e., is to marry as opposed to the use of a prostitute. We all know that's not good, to use a prostitute. But you're supposed to get married so that you have the appropriate thing, as in a wife or a husband, to have each other in a sexual sense. Does that make a little bit of sense? Mm-hmm. But Paul is not commanding them to get married. It's an issue that he deals with later on in the chapter. But a command to live as a married person, especially in the sexual sense. That's what you have a wife, to become one, to form and complete and come back to one. Paul means that husband and wife should continue in sexual relations. But Paul is also not saying that sex is the only thing there is when you get married. It's not the only reason for marriage or the most important reason for it. Paul is simply answering their specific question about marriage, not trying to give a complete theology in marriage. 1 Corinthians 7, 3 through 6. The husband must fulfill his duty to his wife, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise also the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Stop depriving one each another, except by agreement for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer and come together again, so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. But this I say by way of concession, not of command. Instead of a man not touch a woman, within marriage a husband must fulfill his duty to his wife, and vice versa. He is to be giving her the affection that she desires and deserves. Amy and myself, when we do marriage counseling as a couple, we use a book called Love and Respect. And this is a lot of where Eggerman gets his stuff from. Him and his wife, they do marriage counseling together. A lot of their stuff comes from this stuff, love and respect. The wife wants so bad to be loved, and the man wants so bad to be respected. Even if the wife does not, you look at it and say she does not deserve to be loved, you're to do it anyways. And even though she looks at you and says he is not worthy of my respect because he's a terrible person, she's still supposed to respect him. And when you see this all come together under God, it's amazing how well a marriage works out. Love and respect. So this is what Paul is coming down to. Paul also emphasizes that when the woman needs not merely sexual relations, but the affection due to her. What is affection? What is actually affection? It doesn't mean that, oh my gosh, there she wants sex again. Okay, here you go. It's more or less, I am giving you the attention that you desire. Yes. I'm trying to be as good a husband as possible, and I'm going to give you the tender affection, the hugs, the kisses, my ear, so that you can talk. And I'm going to be able to listen to you. If he's not giving her due, then he's not fulfilling what he's commanded to do. Affection also reminds us that when a couple is unable, for physical reasons or something else, to have a complete sexual relationship, they can still have an affectionate relationship and thus fulfill God's purpose of these commands. 1 Peter 3, verses 1 and 2. In the same way, you husbands must give honor to your wives. Treat your wife with understanding as you live together. She may be weaker than you are, but she is your equal partner in God's gift of new life. Treat her as you should, so your prayers will not be hindered. On the same idea also, the wife to her husband. The wife is not to withhold marital affection from her husband. How many times do you hear of people, especially now you girls might not, but I hear of guys going, man, I ain't had it in so long because my wife, I got her mad and she says not until I say.
Sorry.
I hear that quite a bit from guys. And it's like, well, what did you do to her? Oh, I make excuse. And it's like, your excuses are garbage. It's garbage. You need to treat your wife with the love she wants. And guess what? Things will change. The husband has those obligations toward his wife, and she has those same obligations toward her husband. And this emphasis is on giving, on I owe you, not instead of you owe me. Therefore, that's not how it works. In God's heart, sex is put on a much higher level than merely the husband's privilege and the wife's duty. In fact, these obligations are so concrete, it could be said that the wife's body does not even belong to herself. But gosh, neither does the guy's. His body doesn't belong to himself. The same principle is true of that husband. This does not justify a husband abusing or coercing his wife, though, sexually or otherwise. Paul's point is that we have a binding obligation to serve our partner with physical affection. Paul rejects their idea that husband and wife could be more holy by sexual abstinence. In fact, harm can come when they deprive one another as they open the door to the temptation that Satan provides. Isn't that where a lot of the marital troubles come from? Satan sticks in there and gets that little claw going, and pretty soon your eyes are wandering everywhere and you're talking and doing things that you shouldn't be doing, and you're just like I said last week, I wonder how far I can push the limits before I fail. The word deprive is the same word as defraud in 1 Corinthians 6:8 from last week. When we deny that physical affection, and sexual intimacy to our spouse, we cheat them. We cheat them. Sexual deprivation in marriage has not only to do with frequency, but with romance also. This is why Paul tells the husbands to render to the wife the affection that she so deserves and desires. Deprivation in either sense gives occasion for the deprived to look elsewhere for satisfaction. Now, God does not command or even recommend at all abstaining from sex within the marriage. He says, but if you need to do it, why should you do it? To go into prayer and fasting. But as soon as it's over, get back to business. Quit being stupid. Although he never says it's bad anything about prayer and fasting. But you're not to deprive each other. The principle in this passage is important. God makes it clear that there is nothing wrong and everything right about sex in the marriage. There's nothing wrong with it. He encourages it. But see, Satan wants you to have all this stuff outside of marriage. Because see, if you don't have it in the marriage and you have it without, either way, Satan wins. He wins and he's thrilled. Got him again. Got him again. Now this can be seen the way that some of the Christians thought that it was just fine to hire the services of a prostitute. It's just perfectly fine. And others thought it was more spiritual for a husband and wife to never have sexual relations. Satan had planted these seeds. And these people were, I guess, paying attention. A Christian husband and wife must not accept a poor sexual relationship. The problems may not be easily overcome or quickly solved, but God wants every Christian marriage to enjoy a sexual relationship that is a genuine blessing instead of a burden or a curse. Oh gosh, there I got to go be with her again. Oh my gosh. You know, that old thing. Oh, oh. 1 Corinthians 7, 7 through 9. Yet I wish that all men, even as I myself am, however, each man has his own gift from God, one in this manner and another in that. But I say to the unmarried and to the widows that it is good for them if they remain even as I. Well, Paul was unmarried at this point in time when he wrote this letter, but he had probably been married at one time because it's part of the Sanhedrin. It was part of the law. You could not be a member of the Sanhedrin if you were single. They considered marriage a duty that if you weren't married by the time you were 20 years old, you were often excluded from heaven and not real men at all. You know, sometimes I kind of wish that I would look at some of the young punks nowadays and say, you know what? It does not take a real man to be with a woman that young. Don't listen to the garbage that you're being fed. But see, all these Jews may have come up with this from what it told them in Proverbs 18:22. He who finds a good thing and obtains, he who finds a wife finds a good thing and obtains favor from the Lord. This is probably where they got this thing. But also by Paul's own words, remember he was part of the Sanhedrin, and an unmarried man could not be that member. So Paul was probably married at one time. We don't know if he had kids. We don't know what happened to his wife. We don't know if she died, or worse yet, that she went, oh my God, you became a Christian. Get the heck away from me. I don't want to be banished from the church. We just don't know. Either way, Paul was probably well qualified to speak to these people about both issues, singleness and marriage. He's got the experience to deal with both. Significantly, Paul regards both marriage and singleness as gifts from God. Many find themselves in the grass is greener trap. How many people sit there and look at the single people and go, man, they've just got it made. They can do whatever they want. They don't have to get permission. They don't have to do this. And how many of the other people that are single go, man, that grass is greener. They're married. They've got companionship all the time. They've got the things that a married should have. But there's something on both that is a state of a gift from God. Well, Paul recognized that some are gifted for marriage and some are gifted for being unmarried. No one is gifted for sexual immorality. That's not a gift from God. The married must live faithfully to their spouse and the unmarried must live celibate. That's what they're told all throughout the Old Testament. Paul recognizes marriage as a legitimate refuge from the pressures of sexual immorality, which is why he says, if you can't control yourself, get married, for crying out loud. Enough already, people. Many Christian men have been grieved to find his lust for other women did not magically go away after he got married, though. And we still see that today. I couldn't control myself, so I got married, and man, I guess what I got's just not good enough. What's wrong with me? But Paul tells them in 1 Corinthians 7, 10, and 11, but to the married I give instructions, not I, but the Lord, that the wife should not leave her husband, but if she does leave, she must remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband, and that the husband should not divorce his wife. Remember, Paul is still answering the written questions that they sent to him. He has already dealt with the questions about the relative merits of being married or single, and if it is more spiritual to abstain from sex in a marriage relationship. But to thee indicates he is moving to another question that they have. And these questions and answers have to do with marriage and divorce. Paul begins by addressing marriages where both partners are Christians. They wondered if it might be more spiritually single, and if they should break up an existing marriage for the cause of being greater pure. But Paul, answering their question straight from the heart of the Lord, says absolutely not. And Paul is addressing a marriage where both partners are Christians, says that they should not, indeed cannot, break up the marriage in a misguided search for higher spirituality. You are not going to find it. In fact, if we were to depart from our spouse, they must either remain unmarried or reconciled. There's your choices. This connects with the two specific grounds under which God will recognize a divorce, which was when there is sexual immorality, Matthew 19:9. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for immorality and marries another woman commits adultery. And when a believing partner is deserted by an unbelieving spouse, as stated in 1 Corinthians 7:15, on any other grounds, God will not recognize the divorce, even if the state does. If God does not recognize the divorce, then the individual is not free to remarry. They can only be reconciled from their former spouse. When Jesus' disciples understood how binding the marriage covenant was and how it could not be broken in the sight of God for just any old reason, they responded. Matthew 19:10. And the disciples said to him, if the relationship of man with his wife is like this, it is better not to be married. They understood Jesus perfectly, and so should more people today. Don't take this stuff so lightly before they enter into the covenant of marriage. Therefore, if a person says, God just does not want me to be married to this person anymore, or God brought someone better to me, they are wrong and not speaking from God at all. God never recognizes a divorce for such reasons. A Christian couple may in fact separate for reasons that do not justify a biblical divorce. It may be because of a misguided sense of spirituality. It may be because of general unhappiness or conflict or abuse or misery, addiction, or poverty. Paul recognizes at all encouraging that one might depart if such circumstances, but they cannot consider themselves divorced with the right to remarry because, why? Their marriage had not split up for the reasons to justify the stuff that Jesus gave. I just have a hard time with a lot of people in the world today. Well, she's just not all cracked up to what I thought she would be. Therefore, I'm just going to go find me someone else that's more lively. I'm going to find me someone else who does this. Or a gal, he's just old crumb bum. He ain't the person that I knew when I first met him. He lied through it, so I'm going to go find someone else. But even if they do separate, they are to honor their marriage vows. They can live as separate, but not as single. Which even if they live as single, what are they not supposed to do? Fornicate. So therefore, you have to be celibate. Paul applies the same principle to husbands as to wives, and makes the important distinction between one who might depart or separation while still honoring the marriage covenant, and one who might divorce. Except for sexual immorality, which is what Jesus tells them in Matthew 19, verses 3 through 9, two Christians never have a valid reason for it. Just as importantly, Jesus never commands divorce in the case of sexual immorality. He carefully says it is permitted, but why? But why? It's because the hardness of their hearts, according to Matthew 19:8. When we look at 1 Corinthians 7, verses 12 through 16, but to the rest I say, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he must not divorce her. And a woman who has an unbelieving husband, and he consents to live with her, she must not send her husband away. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified through her unbelieving husband. For otherwise your children are unclean, but now they are holy. Yet if the unbelieving one leaves, let him leave. The brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. For how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband, or how do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife? Remember what a yoke is? It's one of the things that when I met Amy, that was the thing that she wanted to be yoked equally with somebody, not unequally. And that was really important. The yoke conveys that idea of two bulls joined to the task of pulling a plow. But if one is not as strong as the other, or they're not two bulls, it's like maybe a goat and an ox or whatever, then you get this really crooked line that always takes place. And this is what it looks like when one partner follows Christ and the other does not. How hard is it when you've all met them? You've all met the couples where one or the other is not a follower of Christ. That marriage can get pretty rocky at times, one way or the other. It's always important to ask ourselves in every area of life how a believer can have a kind of partnership with an unbeliever. And it's especially true in marriage. An unbeliever doesn't follow the Lord, so everything else in their life is an idol, including their spouse. When one decides to follow Christ to the exclusion of anything and anyone else, means that one spouse is not the center of his or her world. Now, I'm not saying we're supposed to worship the very ground they walk on or anything of that nature. But if you don't have your spouse the focus of your attention after God, then you're going to have a hard time and struggle. When one decides to follow Christ, he or she yields to Him first. And His Holy Spirit provides direction. But see, generally, the unbelievers like to go their own merry way. They like to follow their own directions. Well, if I do what God wants, I'm not going to have happiness. Henceforth, like the stuff we saw in between this, where it's like I was watching the TV for 10 minutes before I realized that this woman was talking about all these great and fun things, until I realized it was the Christian channel, and she was talking about all the sins. It's the same thing here. Now, this can cause frustration, anger, and resentment in those marriages. Certainly, these people thought, God can't be glorified if I'm married to an unbeliever for the sake of spirituality. I should divorce them. Paul tells them, no. This spiritual concern is a valid reason for not divorcing them. The spiritual concern is a valid reason for marrying an unbeliever. Because after all, remember, if you're marrying somebody that doesn't believe, it's going to be a very interesting marriage for a while. But it is not a reason for ending an existing marriage with an unbeliever. It's not. Why should a Christian try to keep their marriage to a non-Christian together? Well, because God can be glorified in that marriage. Because if you are married to an unbelieving husband, you can sit there and show him what God's like through your actions. It can bring him to Christ. The same thing with the guy. Your actions and your leadership under a Christian living could bring her to Christ. It simply means that they are set apart for special working in their lives by the Holy Spirit. You still have a duty to do as a Christian. Not only does that presence of a believing spouse do good for the unbelieving one, but it also does good if you have children. Because what happens, and I've seen this, and it's usually the godly women that marry ungodly men, and they have kids, and the wife wants to take the kids to church. When does the husband go to church? Christmas, Easter. The rest of the time he doesn't. Football is more important, baseball, whatever. Fishing, hunting. It's more important. But she has the chance to raise the children as Christians. Most husbands won't argue that one. They won't say no to that. Now, according to what we just read, the children of those, they are blessed. They are saved. They are holy. And they're considered holy until they get to the age of understanding, which you never know how old that is. For me, I don't think I still understand, so therefore, I'm still saved. But it's when each child can make that decision on their own, is when they have to make that decision. However, we have no particular or similar assurance for the children of parents who are not Christians. In fact, the sense of the text argues against it. How could Paul claim it has a benefit for a Christian parent to be in the home if that same benefit automatically applies to the children of non-Christians also? As well, Paul says, otherwise your children are to be unclean. He's clearly giving a sense that apart from the presence of a Christian parent, the child is not regarded as holy, rather as unclean. Unclean. The Greek word for it is akatherotos. In a moral sense, means unclean in thought and life. If you are a child of parents that don't have any idea who God is, who Christ is, and walks in your own way, what kind of moral responsibilities and teachings are you giving your kids? They're going to follow your way. They're going to come up growing up just like you did. They will believe what that parent has taught. The children in turn are influenced to a point that they carry on what they were exposed to growing up. An example, how many of us ourselves have said, now I grew up with Christian parents, but even with my Christian parents, how many of us have said, when I grow up, I am not going to be like that one. I'm going to be my own person. I understand how to live as a Christian, and I'm not going to live like my dad. Only to turn around later on in life after you have kids and you look in the mirror and you go, oh my God, I'm my dad. My favorite one for this is that Progressive Insurance commercial with Dr. Rick. Oh, I love Dr. Rick on them TV commercials. That Parenta life coach admits that it happens to us all after we buy a house. And I love those commercials because, even the one that really kind of tickled me was the husband that kind of started turning into his mom. Sweaters and everything else. But we do have that tendency to follow in the parents' footsteps. If you don't know any better of who Jesus is, you're probably going to follow down the wrong path because you don't know any better. Numbers 14:18.
No.
Well, I missed that one a long time ago, didn't I?
Yeah.
Oof. I skipped, that's all right. We'll press on. Numbers 14:18. I love it when I can do that. Because actually, if you look back at what it says in 2 Corinthians 6:14, it's when being bound to unbelievers. Do not be bound together with unbelievers, for what partnerships have the righteous and lawlessness, or what fellowship has light with darkness. This is why they don't want you to be married ahead of time. If you know what you're getting into, don't do it. But you see, when you're talking about your kids, because remember what it says, Numbers 14:18, the Lord is slow to anger and abundant in loving kindness, forgiving iniquity and transgression, but he will by no means clear the guilty, visiting iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and the fourth generations. It takes a long time sometimes, if you cannot break that cycle, to get where you need to be. If the children of non-Christian parents are saved and do not go to heaven, even some of them, if the children of non-Christian parents are saved and do not go to heaven, even some of them, it is important to understand that they were saved not because of what they did, but because of God's mercy. As the sons and daughters of guilty Adam, we are born guilty. If such children do not go to heaven, it is not because they are deserving innocence, but because that rich mercy of God has been extended to them as well. So yes, Do not divorce your unbelieving spouse, if we don't have any in here, I know. Don't divorce them. But if the unbeliever departs, let him go. Go ahead. Malachi 2:14b and 15. Because the Lord has been a witness between you and the wife of your youth, against whom you have dealt treacherously, though she is your companion and your wife by covenant. But not one has done so who has a remnant of the Spirit. And what did that one do while he was seeking a godly offspring? Take heed then to your spirit, and let no one deal treacherously against the wife of your youth. Paul has counseled that the Christian partner should do what they can to keep that marriage together. You need to. But if the unbelieving spouse refuses to be married, then the marriage can be broken. But this isn't to be initiated or sought by the believer. You can't make the threats. If the unbelieving spouse should depart, the Christian is not under bondage to the marriage covenant. This means that they are in fact free to marry, to remarry, because God has recognized their divorce as a valid one. Paul ends this section with a great deal of hope, because many Christians who are married to unbelievers, they're discouraged. They should know that with faith and patience, they can look to God to do work in their present marriage and circumstances, difficult as they may be. Christians married to unbelievers should also know what Paul says, or what Peter says in 1 Peter 3, verses 1 through 6. That your unbelieving spouse will probably not be led to Jesus by your words. But how? By your godly and loving conduct. When we're dealing with our friends, that we know they have this situation and this split, and the one is discouraged, give them the encouragement. No, stay together. Bring them kids up proper under the church. Live the godly life that you're supposed to be that influence. It's still a witness, just like how we witness with ourselves. When you're walking the talk, people notice. And they will eventually come up. It may not be immediately, but eventually they will come up and say, why is your life so different? And they've just opened that door for a wonderful flood of, let me tell you what God has done for me. Let's go to prayer.